My name is Marcus Johnson, and for much of my life, I have served in a modern urban police department that prides itself on upholding the law. However, beneath those shiny badges and well-oiled routines lies a system steeped in corruption and moral decay. As a black police officer, I've consistently refused to compromise my ethical standards, even when it seemed that every other officer was willing to barter their integrity for quick gains. This is my story, a first-person account of integrity tested against an environment riddled with vice, where even the most hardened officers succumb to the temptations of easy corruption, revealing the profound struggles faced by those still committed to justice. My journey began with unwavering optimism, navigating the city streets in my marked patrol car, eager to make a difference. Every call that came through the radio felt like an opportunity to uplift my community and defend the vulnerable, a feeling reinforced by the numerous stories shared by local residents grateful for our support. But as time passed, I began to notice the cracks in our foundation, the late-night whispers between colleagues, the way certain cases vanished without a trace, and how justice often twisted in favor of those who could afford to pay for silence. Over the years, I witnessed countless instances where the badge was misused. Officers turned a blind eye to misconduct or participated in dubious deals with local drug lords, thereby contributing to the erosion of community trust. While most men would silence their conscience for the sake of camaraderie, or perhaps fear of isolation, I found myself increasingly alienated, burdened by my principles. Each day that I chose not to indulge in the corruption around me felt like an uphill battle, where my ideals clashed with the deteriorating state of law enforcement and its growing discord with the very community we were meant to protect. Then came the moment that would change everything. A patrol shift took a harrowing turn one evening when I stumbled upon a scene that was all too familiar, yet still managed to shock me to my core. A fellow officer, whom I had once considered a trusted ally, was caught red-handed accepting a bribe from a known criminal. The chaos that unfolded in that moment felt like a thunderclap. I had two choices: uphold what I'd always believed in and expose him, or look the other way and protect my own career. As I stood there, heart racing, I realized that this was a pivotal moment in my life. Would I be another name on the ever-growing list of officers who had chosen complicity, or would I stand against the tide? I made my choice that night, guided by a sense of justice that demanded accountability, not just from others, but from myself as well. I reported the incident, fully aware of the consequences that awaited me. Those who lived in the shadows of corruption do not forgive easily. A target was now painted on my back. But even as friendships soured, new allies emerged, individuals who were equally tired of the systemic malfeasance. They were younger officers, inspired by a desire to do good and energized by the prospect of change, who saw my stand as a beacon of hope illuminating the path forward. This newfound camaraderie helped us envision a stronger police force, one committed to transparency and accountability, and motivated us to continue fighting against the pervasive corruption. Together, we forged a movement within the department aimed at seeking reform, shining light on the darkness, and challenging the twisted narrative that had taken root for far too long. It was a grueling process filled with obstacles, silent threats, and veiled retaliation, but with each small victory, we grew more courageous. They say a single flame can illuminate a dark room. I began to see our efforts igniting sparks across the precinct. Now, as I find myself at a crucial crossroads, I reflect on the power of resilience and the necessity of bonds forged in honesty. This story is not just about me, but about the collective fight against a deeply entrenched culture of corruption. It is also the story of a community that deserves to believe in the protectors meant to safeguard them. A narrative that I am determined to expand, chapter by chapter, until every dark corner is illuminated and integrity is restored to its rightful place within the badge. I still remember the day I first walked through the doors of Precinct 17, full of idealism and a burning desire to make a difference. I had grown up in neighborhoods where trust was a luxury and hope was a rare commodity. Raised by parents who instilled in me the values of honesty and perseverance, I knew that donning a badge meant more than enforcing the law. It meant being a pillar of the community. However, it wasn't long before I noticed that things were not as they seemed behind the closed doors of our station. The precinct had a reputation for harboring officers who had long abandoned the oath they had taken. It was a place where loyalty to one another often meant overlooking the darker deeds that transpired in the shadows. Every day I strived to uphold the principles I had been raised with, often feeling like a lone candle flickering in a darkened room. I watched as officers I once admired turned a blind eye to corruption, dismissing my concerns with teasing laughter and a shrug that echoed a troubling acceptance of the status quo. The camaraderie I had hoped to find was tainted by an undercurrent of fear. Fear of losing their jobs or being ostracized by their peers, which strengthened my resolve to make a stand against what was clearly wrong. With each investigation that was mysteriously dropped, I felt a little piece of my resolve crumble, questioning the values that had motivated me to join the force. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had a responsibility to the very people I had promised to protect. To the children who played in streets littered with broken glass, to the families trapped in cycles of violence and despair. I began to keep quiet notes in the dead of night, documenting everything. The missing evidence from cases, the officers who turned up at bars getting cozy with local dealers, the mundane yet haunting patterns that seemed to repeat like a grim melody. As weeks turned into months, I found myself at a crossroad where the significant decisions of integrity weighed heavily on my conscience. Each decision grew heavier, and thoughts of approaching internal affairs filled me with dread. As the fear of retaliation loomed larger than I could have imagined, paranoia settled among the ranks, and whispers of informants and snitches haunted my thoughts like a dark cloud threatening to break into a downpour. I recalled the stories of those who had tried to stand up against the corruption. Some had been reassigned to desolate posts, their reputations tarnished. Others vanished altogether from the precinct, their names now only whispers in the wind. It wasn't until a promising lead landed on my desk, a local gang handing out food and supplies to families affected by the crime wave, that I saw a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. Perhaps there was a way to bridge the gap. By collaborating with community leaders and empowering the very residents we were sworn to protect, I could start a dialogue, rebuild that fragile trust. With a heart full of determination, I decided to take the risk. So, I reached out to local activists, forming alliances that transcended the walls of our precinct. Slowly, I began to notice a shift. People were willing to trust the badge again, if only for the promise of change. They shared their stories with me, their fears and aspirations. I felt renewed, like a sapling pushing through the frost, eager to find the sunlight. Together, we organized community cleanups and safety workshops. The precinct's reputation began to shift, becoming less about the badge and more about the people who wore it. Yet, the journey toward reform was fraught with opposition, and I knew the path ahead would be steep and riddled with obstacles. Every good deed in Precinct 17 came at a cost, and as I prepared to face resistance from those who resisted change, I steeled myself for the battle to come. My idealism had not vanished. It had transformed into a stubborn resolve to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. I was no longer just a rookie in a uniform. I was a beacon of hope challenging the dark, ready to confront the shadows that loomed over Precinct 17. In my first weeks, I encountered subtle hints of moral compromise. A seasoned sergeant who would wink conspiratorially while shaking hands with known criminals, an investigator who dismissed evidence if it didn't suit his personal agenda, and an entire division that had learned to thrive off the criminals they were supposed to be rooting out. But I clung to my conviction that one could make a difference by standing as a beacon of integrity, even if it meant fighting an uphill battle against a tide of corruption. It was a late autumn evening when I was called to the scene of a robbery in a rundown neighborhood. The urgency in the call had me racing to the location, a mix of adrenaline and trepidation coursing through me. Upon arrival, I encountered a scene that felt almost cinematic. The flashing lights of patrol cars, distraught victims, and an unmistakable tension in the air. I introduced myself to the victims and began gathering their accounts, all the while noticing a small crowd of officers congregated near the perimeter. Among them was Officer Rick Lawson, a man who had served long enough to witness decades of change in this city. Though he wore his uniform with pride, an unmistakable glint in his eye suggested hidden allegiances. As I began piecing together witness statements, a senior detective, whom I had admired for his strict commitment to justice, arrived on the scene. Detective Stevens pulled me aside and whispered, "Marcus, sometimes what we see on the surface is only half the story." His words lingered in the air like fog, dense and suffocating. I glanced back at Officer Lawson, who was engaged in a hushed conversation with a couple of low-level informants. A sense of unease washed over me. What could he possibly be discussing? Detective Stevens seemed to notice my distraction and placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Stay focused, Marcus. You're about to dive deep into something bigger than you can imagine," he warned, his voice steady but laced with urgency. As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the alleyway, I couldn't help but feel the weight of curiosity tugging at me. I was drawn to the whispers of betrayal and loyalty that, like threads, interwove the various stories surrounding the precinct. In that moment, I decided I would need to confront Lawson directly. Understanding the man who wore a badge meant understanding the city itself. I approached Lawson as he finished speaking, his demeanor shifting from casual to guarded with each step I took. "Officer Lawson," I called out, keeping my tone professional yet firm. He turned, eyes narrowing slightly at my interruption. "Can we talk?" For a moment he hesitated, weighing the risks of engaging with a rookie detective against the potential fallout of ignoring my query. His face revealed an internal struggle, and finally he nodded and led me to a more secluded corner of the alley, away from prying ears. This brief moment offered me a glimpse into Lawson's guarded nature, suggesting that there were complexities within him that I needed to unravel. For a moment, he hesitated, weighing the risks of engaging with a rookie detective against the potential fallout of ignoring my query. Finally, he nodded and led me to a more secluded corner of the alley, away from prying ears. I took a deep breath, trying to choose my words wisely. "What kind of balance?" I pressed. "What's really happening in this city?" His eyes flickered, and for an instant, I saw the weight of his years and the force in his expression. A myriad of missed opportunities, moral dilemmas, and unspoken truths that had shaped his character. "You have to understand, it's not just about the law. There are forces at play that the badge doesn't weigh against. Those you trust may not always have your back. Just look at the cases we've got piling up. There's a pattern, and it's not what anyone wants to hear. The truth can be uncomfortable, especially when it reveals that some of us wear our badges not as symbols of justice, but as a means to an end." My heart raced. The detective's words carried the gravity of a prophecy. Each revelation felt like a piece of a puzzle slowly falling into place, yet the picture was still shrouded in shadow. "Then guide me, Officer Lawson," I implored. "I need to know what it is I'm facing." He paused, deliberating whether to dive into the abyss of real truth or keep me shielded from the harsh realities of his world. "You've got guts, kid'em. Just remember, when you peel back the layers, sometimes what you find can't be unfound." With that, he turned away, leaving me standing in the half-light of the encroaching night, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. As I watched him walk off, the weight of the city's secrets loomed heavy and palpable in the damp evening air. I made up my mind. The truth, however elusive or dangerous, would not evade me. It was time to dig deeper and uncover the hidden allegiances that ran like veins through the heart of the city. I learned later that night that the robbery was not as random as it first appeared. Rumors circulated that the criminals had received a tip-off from someone inside the department, a stark reminder that betrayal could emerge from the very institution meant to protect the public. My heart pounded in my chest as I grasped the gravity of the situation. My loyalty to the badge was now pitted against the truth. In that moment, I silently vowed to never let corruption taint my sense of duty. As the months passed, I began to observe a pattern emerging. There were careful manipulations of evidence, quiet exchanges of envelopes containing illicit funds, and whispered conversations in dimly lit halls hinting at favors being traded like currency. Each workday, I found myself navigating a minefield of ethical dilemmas, often feeling like a soldier in a war against my own comrades. In a department where camaraderie was often a code word for covering up one another's misdeeds, maintaining moral clarity became both my mission and my isolation. One particular incident still haunts me. I was assigned to a stakeout involving a drug ring that had been under surveillance for weeks. The inside source, whose identity was known only to a select few in the division, promised substantial evidence of the syndicate's operations. Just as we were on the verge of executing a major bust, I intercepted a hushed conversation between two officers. They were discussing how a tip-off made it apparent that the drug ring's leader was planning to bribe a high-ranking official to escape prosecution. My blood ran cold. This was no longer a case solely about criminals, but a calculated move by corrupt officers to shield their own. My mind raced as I processed the implications of what I had just overheard. If the tip-off was accurate, not only was our mission compromised, but lives could be at risk. A tightening knot formed in my stomach. I had to act swiftly and discreetly. Knowing that time was of the essence, I slipped away from my position, carefully avoiding the conversations around me. The last thing I needed was to draw suspicion before I could gather more information. I decided to head to the nearest break room, where I hoped I could dig deeper into the shadows that loomed over this investigation. Once inside, I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a quick message to my partner. Mark, Nasser Urim, need to talk. Urgent. I didn't have to wait long, he replied almost instantly, agreeing to meet at our usual spot around the corner. As I left the break room, I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on my shoulders. Arriving at the rendezvous, Mark could see the urgency in my expression. What's going on? He asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I recounted the conversation I had overheard, my voice barely above a whisper. His face paled as I described the possible corruption within our own ranks. This is serious, Orn, he replied, shaking his head in disbelief. If they're in on it, this could endanger not just the case, but the safety of everyone involved. The reality of our situation began to seep in. If we were to proceed with a bust, we needed to ensure that the corrupt officers were not tipped off. I suggested we gather evidence to confirm the corruption before taking any further action. Mark nodded but voiced a counterpoint. We need to be cautious. If they catch wind of us investigating their operations, we could find ourselves on the wrong end of a very dangerous game. As we drove through the darkened streets of the city, my mind spiraled with possibilities. Would we expose the rot lying beneath the surface of our department? Or would we unwittingly play into the hands of those betraying their oath? One thing was clear. We had to act quickly before the drug ring's leader, aided by corrupt officials, evaded the law for good. As we drove through the darkened streets of the city, my mind spiraled with possibilities. Would we expose the rot that lay beneath the surface of our department? Or would we unwittingly play into the hands of those who betrayed their oath? One thing was clear. We had to act quickly before the drug ring's leader, aided by corrupt officials, escaped the law for good. On the night of the meeting, every element felt heightened, charged with the anticipation of what lay ahead. As I approached the dimly lit diner where we were to meet the source, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This was it, the moment that could either save our investigation or dismantle everything we'd worked for. Stepping inside, I spotted the source in a booth at the back, looking nervously over his shoulder. I slid into the seat across from him. You have something for me? I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. But before he could respond, the door swung open and I felt the air shift. A chill ran down my spine as I recognized one of the officers who had been part of the whispered conversation. He was here, searching for me. The uneasy tension blossomed into panic as I signaled to Mark discreetly. We had to leave, and we had to leave now. Grabbing the source by the arm, I led him out through the back exit, my mind racing with the stakes of what lay ahead. The threat was immediate, darkening our mission like storm clouds gathering over a sunny day. As we took off into the night, I couldn't help but wonder how deep the corruption ran and whether we could truly outrun it. The answers ahead were cloaked in shadows, and the risk was greater than I had ever imagined. But I knew one thing. If we were going to fight this, we had to be smarter than our foes and prepared for whatever game they were playing. Torn between duty and the fear of ostracism, I struggled with the decision of whom to trust. It seemed that every action, every decision, was tainted by the gravity of what these men had allowed themselves to become. In the quiet moments before dawn, as I sat in my cramped apartment over cups of lukewarm coffee, I questioned everything. The ideals that had driven me to join the force began to feel like relics of a bygone era in a department that had long abandoned its higher purpose. It was an icy winter night when the situation escalated to a level that I could no longer ignore. I received an urgent call about a domestic disturbance at a rundown apartment complex. Arriving at the scene, I found more than just a case of domestic strife. It was a convergence of violence and injustice. An officer known for his ruthlessness, Officer Daniels, who had already built a reputation for bending the rules, was present. I had always felt a chill whenever I saw him. His methods were as brutal as they were efficient. The call had come from a terrified woman whose husband had been involved in a serious altercation with Daniels. The man, clearly on the brink of life and death, was in critical condition. It wasn't long before I discovered that Daniels had not only used excessive force, but had also tampered with the evidence to cover up his actions. The pressure in the air was palpable as whispers of cover-up and collusion began to echo down the cold corridors of the precinct. As I sifted through the mounting evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that a deeper conspiracy lay beneath the surface. Officers who once stood by their oath to protect and serve were now glancing over their shoulders, wary of the implications that came with questioning one of their own. Each new piece of information I uncovered painted a troubling picture, suggesting that Daniels was not acting alone. His connections ran deep within the department, and the thought of dismantling this web of deceit filled me with both dread and determination. Late into the night, I found myself reviewing multiple body camera feeds from the precinct. Staring intently, I noticed discrepancies in the recorded times and locations of Daniel's patrol. It was as if someone had deliberately edited the footage, erasing critical moments that could provide clarity to the chaotic incident that had left the community reeling. As I paused the video, a familiar face caught my attention. A rookie cop, barely out of training, who was present during the encounter and seemed hesitant to speak up. Her wide eyes betrayed the fear that seeped through the force's camaraderie. With a leap of intuition, I decided to reach out to her. Over coffee in a dimly lit diner that smelled of burnt coffee and uncertainty, she opened up, her voice trembling. I didn't want to believe it. We all looked up to Daniels. But now I'm scared. Scared of what will happen if I say something, she confessed, glancing over her shoulder. Her admissions only reinforced my resolve. The scales of justice were uneven, and it was time to set them right. As the sun dawned on another day, I gathered my thoughts and prepared to confront the Internal Affairs Unit. I wasn't just fighting for the man in critical condition anymore. I was fighting for every officer who had ever felt silenced by the fear of repercussions, for the culture of corruption that threatened our community. Armed with testimonies and evidence, I pushed through the precinct doors, ready to speak the truth, even if it meant standing against my own. What I didn't expect was the fierce resistance. I had barely started when the inspector, a bulldog of a man with a reputation for squashing dissent, leaned back in his chair, a mocking smile playing on his lips. You think you can come here with your little pile of papers and take down one of our top guys? You better understand what you're getting into, he warned, his voice a low rumble that echoed with menace. But I stood firm, knowing that sometimes the right path was the hardest one to walk. As the walls closed in and I felt the heat of scrutiny from my colleagues, I realized I had to be cautious. This was a treacherous game, and I had to play it smart. I began to compile discreet reports from officers who were willing to talk, slowly building a network of allies who, like me, believed in the values we'd sworn to uphold. Each conversation forged a little tighter bond, and I resolved to take my findings to the media if need be. The truth had to come to light, regardless of the consequences. Days turned into weeks, and as I dove deeper into the murky waters of institutional betrayal, a shocking truth began to emerge. A hidden network composed of those who saw their duty not to protect, but to protect each other at any cost. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. The man in critical condition needed justice, and we were running out of time. In the face of overwhelming odds, I would expose every last one of them. This fight was far from over. As I processed the unfolding crisis, I felt compelled to rally those who shared my vision for a transparent and accountable police force. The task before us loomed, yet we understood that together we could confront the darkness and cultivate a brighter future. The investigation into Officer Daniels quickly escalated into one of the most dangerous and high-stakes endeavors I had ever undertaken. I meticulously gathered evidence, documented inconsistencies, and built a case that I knew could shatter the web of corruption that had ensnared our department. It wasn't long before I found myself face to face with some of the most powerful figures within the precinct. Meetings in back alleys, whispered warnings over the phone, and the constant sense that every step could be my last became a part of my everyday reality. One particular confrontation remains etched in my memory. In a dimly lit conference room, I sat across from Lieutenant Harris, a man whose index finger had been raised in silent command of the corrupt network that led our department astray. His eyes held a cold indifference as he leaned forward and said, "Officer Johnson, you're playing with fire. You need to let sleeping dogs lie." His tone was as much a threat as it was an invitation to back down. "What's at stake here, Lieutenant?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Lives are at risk, and you want me to turn a blind eye to the genuine suffering of our community?" Harris's lips curled into a smirk, a deceptive show of confidence. "You're idealistic, Johnson. This isn't about right and wrong. It's about survival. You think you're the first to challenge the status quo? Others have tried and failed. The deeper you dig, the more you'll regret it. And if I do nothing, what happens then? More lives lost, more families torn apart. His expression hardened momentarily before he chuckled, a cold, unsettling sound. You're a brave one. I'll give you that. But bravery doesn't count for much when it leads you right off a cliff. He leaned back in his chair, as if settling in for a long argument, his confidence unwavering. There are forces here far beyond your reckoning. You've got no idea how deep this runs. Then help me understand, I shot back, my impatience boiling over. I'm not looking for a fight, but if there's a chance to expose this corruption, I need your insight, not your threats. I want to know how I can navigate the barriers put in place to shield those who violate the trust we've sworn to uphold. A beat passed, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. You really want answers? Fine. But know this. Once you step over that line, there's no coming back. That's a risk I'm willing to take, I replied, a surge of adrenaline pulsing through me. The conversation shifted from a standoff to something resembling an uneasy truce. Harris leaned forward again, this time with a hint of seriousness that hadn't been there before. You'll need allies, and you'll need to keep your head down. People don't like it when the foundation of their power is threatened. The conversation shifted from a standoff to something resembling an uneasy truce. Harris leaned forward again, this time with a hint of seriousness that hadn't been there before. You'll need allies, and you'll need to keep your head down. People don't like it when the foundation of their power is threatened. As our conversation progressed, the weight of my mission settled heavily on my shoulders. I was stepping into a dangerous world, one filled with manipulation, betrayal, and the unknown. But I would not falter. The confrontation with Harris had ignited something within me, a burning desire to seek justice, no matter the cost. From that moment on, I knew the path ahead would be fraught with peril, but the alternative, silence, was far worse. With newfound determination, I stood up, extending my hand across the table. Then let's get to work. I responded with a calm that belied the turmoil churning inside me. I joined this force to protect and serve, not to serve my own interests or those of a criminal underworld. I will follow through on every lead until the truth is uncovered. My words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. Although Lieutenant Harris tried to mask his fury behind a veneer of professionalism, I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he weighed the consequences of my persistence. In the days that followed, I felt the full weight of isolation and reprisal. Colleagues who had once greeted me with smiles now offered me cold stares. My superiors, once respected, began to distance themselves, fearing that my actions might incite repercussions across the precinct. I understood then that standing for what was right might come at the cost of my reputation, my friendships, and even my safety. Yet deep within me, a fierce determination grew, a determination to see justice done, regardless of the sacrifices demanded. As the investigation into Officer Daniels unfolded, it inadvertently served as a catalyst that set off a chain reaction. Rumors began to spill into every corner of the station, and whispered conversations filled the hallways. I was not alone in my pursuit of the truth. There were others among us, quiet, remorseful eyes behind hardened exteriors, who had grown tired of the pervasive rot. Among these was Officer Jenkins, a once bright young man whose initial idealism had been corroded by the realities of police work. Officer Jenkins had always been a bit naive about the true nature of the department, but as I confided in him about the evidence against Daniels and the influence of certain high-ranking officials, I saw a change in him. Over late-night coffee breaks and long shifts spent poring over case files, he revealed his own inner conflict. "Marcus," he said one evening, "I've seen things I never thought possible. I joined because I believed in serving our community, but now I feel lost, like I'm just a pawn in a game with no winners." His voice trembled slightly, revealing a vulnerability that surprised me. I leaned in, sensing that tonight could be a turning point. "Officer Jenkins, you're not just a pawn. You have the power to change things. If we expose the corruption, we could save lives, real lives." He looked at me, a flicker of hope lighting up his tired eyes, but doubt still lingered. "And if they come after us, we'll expose their secrets, gather the right allies. It's time for the community to know the truth," I reassured him, feeling the weight of our conversation pressing against my chest. He nodded slowly, weighing the gravity of our discussion. The next few weeks, we worked in secrecy. Late nights blurred into early mornings as we pored over evidence and connected with network contacts. This was no longer just about the case against Daniels. It became a struggle against a system that seemed determined to devour those it was meant to protect. Jenkins grew more assertive, challenging the status quo at roll calls, asking uncomfortable questions that drew whispers but no answers. Then came the night that changed everything. As we sifted through incriminating photos on my laptop, we discovered something explosive, a tie between Daniels and high-ranking officials that extended into the heart of our community's leadership. This is huge, Marcus, Jenkins exclaimed, disbelief mingling with exhilaration. If we can prove this, it could shift everything. The sense of urgency hung heavy in the air as we plotted our next steps. But the deeper we delved, the more we sensed the danger. Unmarked cars lingered outside of Jenkins' apartment. Shadows moved in and out of our peripheral vision, and a chilling realization took hold. We were being watched. One fateful night, as we left the diner after a clandestine meeting, we were approached by a figure cloaked in darkness, a low voice echoing out, "You two should tread lightly. The walls have ears." With that warning clear, fear seeped into the cracks of our resolve. We were at a crossroads, fear tugged at us, yet the need for justice burned brighter. "What if we leave town? Go somewhere safe," Jenkins suggested, his usually firm stance faltering. I shook my head. Running isn't the answer. We have to fight back. We owe that much to ourselves and those who rely on the truth. Days turned into weeks, and as tensions escalated, our alliance with a local journalist, Lisa, proved invaluable. She had sources and a tenacity that rivaled our determination. Together, we orchestrated a media campaign that would expose the corruption at its roots. It wasn't just a story, it was a mission. As we drew closer to the truth, it became increasingly clear that the forces against us were stronger and more relentless than we had anticipated. But what we found was surprising. Support from unexpected corners of our community rallied behind us. They whispered stories of their own experiences, each a thread in the tapestry of disillusionment we shared. Then came the day when we finally released the details to the public. The reactions were explosive. Protests erupted, spreading like wildfire throughout the city. People rallied, demanding accountability and transparency. Jenkins and I stood side by side at the forefront, his earlier naivety replaced with a steadfast determination. But in the chaos that followed, danger loomed closer. Threatening messages started flooding our phones, and we received cryptic warnings about what happens when you cross the line. Yet surrounded by supporters, as the crowd chanted for change, I knew we had ignited a flame that couldn't easily be extinguished. "This isn't just about us anymore," I told Jenkins, as we watched the ocean of people in solidarity. "We're fighting for something bigger." He nodded, a fierce glint in his eye, ready to stand firm against the storm that was sure to come. His words resonated deeply, for they echoed the internal strife experienced by so many who had gradually succumbed to the corruption around them. Jenkins's transformation wasn't instantaneous, but his growing disillusionment signified that even hardened criminals within the force were wrestling with their own conscience. This revelation reaffirmed my belief that integrity was not merely an attribute, but a choice, a daily commitment to doing what was right despite overwhelming odds. As the evidence against Daniels accumulated, so too did the correspondence from elsewhere in the department. Anonymous notes, leaked files, and discreet conversations provided further proof that the corruption ran deeper than a single officer's misdeeds. There were entire networks at play. I found myself entangled not just in an investigation against one man, but in a battle against a system designed to protect its own interests at any cost. Every day was a struggle against the temptation to compromise, reflecting the choices many of my peers faced. I questioned, how much could one man endure before the weight of collective guilt became overwhelming? In the solitude of long nights and on the edge of countless dangerous confrontations, I wrestled with the philosophical ramifications of justice in a corrupt system, knowing full well that my actions, whether right or wrong, could either be a decisive turn toward change or a step deeper into the abyss of moral failure. There were moments, too, when I questioned whether my fight was worth it. On one occasion, while driving home after a particularly grueling day, I pondered the faces of those who had fallen by the wayside of corruption. My partner on that shift, a man with a troubled past and a heart weighed down by regret, had once confided in me his fear of being swallowed up by the rot. "Marcus," he had said softly, "sometimes I wonder if all our sacrifices will make a difference. If one honest man can only move one mountain, then what is the point?" His words struck me like a bolt of lightning and forced me to re-examine what I was truly fighting for. As I sat in the car, the dim glow of the streetlights illuminating the cracked pavement, I felt a profound sense of isolation. The quiet hum of the engine was interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of the turn signal, marking the passage of time I couldn't afford to waste. I thought back to Marcus's words, how they hung in the air like the smoke from a distant bonfire, both alluring and toxic. What if he was right? What if our efforts were simply slow grains of sand slipping through the hourglass of a larger machine, one that seemed determined to consume everything in its path? Just then, my phone buzzed with an incoming message, breaking the silence like the crack of thunder. It was a news alert about a recent scandal involving some high-profile officials I had long suspected of wrongdoing. Their faces flashed across the screen, and for the first time that day, I felt a flicker of hope ignite inside me. Perhaps our fight was not in vain after all. If the truth could still make headlines, could it also awaken the conscience of those who had turned a blind eye for too long? Just then, my phone buzzed with an incoming message, breaking the silence like the crack of thunder. It was a news alert about a recent scandal involving some high-profile officials I had long suspected of wrongdoing, drawing a direct connection between our department's operations and the politicians whose interests were intertwined with crime. Their faces flashed across the screen, and for the first time that day, I felt a flicker of hope ignite inside me, a powerful reminder that perhaps our fight was part of something larger. If the truth could still make headlines, could it also awaken the conscience of those who had turned a blind eye for too long? I remembered how her words had stirred something deep within me that evening, a resolve to not just fight the corruption, but to understand it, to dissect its roots and spread the seeds of accountability. I had vowed that day to be relentless in our pursuit of justice, to be the catalyst for change that our community so desperately needed. Yet with Marcus's apprehension echoing in my ears, I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that maybe our idealism was just a naive dream in a world so entrenched in its vices. Arriving home, I parked my car and sat for a moment, gazing out at the serene silhouette of the neighborhood against the starry sky. I had fought fiercely for this life, this community, and the people who deserved better. Suddenly, clarity washed over me like a cleansing rain. Perhaps it wasn't about moving mountains, but about setting small stones in place that could one day shift the landscape of our fight. One honest act, one small sacrifice amidst this colossal battle could spark a chain reaction. If every officer, every dedicated citizen took just one stand, we could begin cultivating a garden of integrity in a field that had long been barren. I stepped out of the car, a newfound sense of determination coursing through my veins. Tomorrow would begin a new phase, a commitment not just to fight against the corruption that threatened to consume us, but to inspire others to join us in this endeavor. The road ahead would be arduous, littered with obstacles that would test our resolve. But armed with purpose, I felt ready to take those first few steps, one stone at a time. I realized then that the battle was not just external. It was an ongoing internal war against despair, disillusionment, and the lure of expediency. True integrity meant being steadfast in the face of overwhelming darkness. Even as I saw some of my colleagues succumb to the allure of corruption, I clung to the belief that change was possible and that redemption could be achieved even in the most tainted of souls. Late one night, after an exhaustive day of covert interviews and secret meetings with reform-minded officers, I retreated to an abandoned corner of the city. Sitting on a stoop beneath a flickering street lamp, I wrote in my worn notebook under the sparse glow of a single bulb. I penned down my thoughts on sacrifice, the cost of righteousness, and the hope that somewhere amidst the darkness lay a path to redemption. I vowed that no matter how high the stakes became, I would continue to fight for the soul of our department. The turning point came unexpectedly. A series of small yet significant events sparked a gradual shift within the precinct. Influenced by the accumulation of undeniable evidence and the courage of a few willing to stand up, some officers began to publicly distance themselves from the corrupt practices that had long been tolerated. Among them was Officer Jenkins, whose transformation now served as a living testament to the possibility of change. One brisk morning, as gray light filtered through the tall, urban silhouettes of the city, a group of reform-minded officers gathered in an isolated conference room. There, in a hushed yet determined tone, they discussed initiating a full-scale internal review of departmental practices, emphasizing the importance of accountability and transparency in restoring public trust. My presence among them served as a quiet testament to the belief that together we could make a tangible difference. Over the next few weeks, what began as covert meetings in dimly lit corners evolved into open debates held in the conference room, where the air was thick with tension, yet crackling with newfound energy. Guarded exchanges, once laced with suspicion and muted voices, transformed into passionate arguments, echoing through the precinct as officers finally found their voices. As we dissected the entrenched practices that had plagued our ranks for far too long, it became clear that some, like Lieutenant Harris and a select few of his cohorts, clung desperately to their power, using intimidation and manipulation in a last-ditch effort to maintain the status quo. However, a significant shift was unfolding. Many began to see the futility of their actions, and the fear that had governed their choices began to dissipate like mist in the morning sun. I watched, torn between despair and cautious optimism, as fierce loyalty to corruption began to crumble like old plaster, revealing the rusty underpinnings of injustice hidden beneath. Those who had once been enforcers of the underhanded deals started to realize that the very system they had manipulated was fracturing under its own weight, and the reality of their complicity weighed heavily on their shoulders. Conversations grew bolder, laden with the risk of retaliation, yet illuminating a pathway toward integrity. It was as if a long-stifled truth was being unearthed, and a collective awareness began to spread among us that our roles in this corruption did not have to define our futures. A movement was silently brewing, a revolution of conscience that was gradually gaining traction within our ranks. One incident in particular marked a definitive shift. During an undercover operation targeting a notorious drug syndicate, a senior officer openly refused to falsify evidence, a demand that had become routine within the precinct. His act of defiance emboldened many of us. When news of his arrest for insubordination made headlines, it sent shockwaves throughout the department. For the first time, even the most jaded officers began to see a glimpse of what could be, a department where integrity was restored at great personal risk, but with the promise of genuine justice. Despite the budding movement for reform, the journey was far from over. I knew that standing for what was right in a system so steeped in corruption came at a profound cost, the kind that could shake the very foundations of one's soul. My actions had made me a marked man, an outcast in an environment that thrived on silence and complicity. I felt the weight of isolation as some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others vilified me behind closed doors. The phone calls that came in the middle of the night, laced with veiled threats and easily identifiable malice, served as a grim reminder that my stance placed a target on my back. Each buzz of the phone echoing through my empty apartment sent shivers down my spine, pulling me deeper into a vortex of paranoia. I began to notice strangers following me on my commute, their furtive glances making my skin crawl. Suddenly, the once familiar streets became a maze of potential danger. The toll on my personal life was immense. Friends who once laughed at my jokes became cautious around me, their smiles fading as they weighed the risks of association. Even family members burdened with worry expressed their concerns for my safety, their unspoken fears a constant reminder of the stakes I faced. One bleak evening, after what felt like an eternity of back-to-back meetings with reform advocates, I was ambushed in a dark alley as I left the station, the shadows swallowing me whole. The air was thick with tension, and a sense of impending doom hung heavy around me. The group of men waiting there had faces I recognized, their grim expressions a chilling testament to how deeply the corruption ran within our own ranks. Their eyes reflected a mixture of pity, perhaps for my naive stubbornness, and disdain, which cut deeper than any physical blow. "You've gone too far this time, Marcus," one of them sneered, the malice dripping off his words like venom. "You're going to bring this whole place down on all of us." The threat was as clear as the bitter chill in the air, and every muscle in my body tensed instinctively as I realized that even here, in the very heart of the city I had sworn to protect, betrayal lurked around every corner, festering like an untreated wound. I stood my ground, summoning the strength that had carried me through countless trials and tribulations. With every ounce of resolve I could muster, I faced them, my voice steady amidst the chaotic heartbeat of my fear. "I'm not trying to bring anyone down," I asserted, my tone calm yet laced with an underlying urgency. "I'm trying to bring us back up, to a place where the badge we wear is a symbol of service to the people, not a shield for our own dark interests." My words, though steady, resonated with the weight of conviction that had fueled my journey from the very beginning. In that moment, I understood it was not merely about me, it was about our shared responsibility. A call to arms for those willing to confront the darkness and reaffirm our commitment to the values we were sworn to uphold. That night, as I returned to my modest apartment, I spent hours reflecting on the cost of integrity. Each ticking second felt heavier than the last, a reminder of the weight I carried on my shoulders. I had lost friends, some who had turned their backs, unable to comprehend the perilous road I had chosen, and others who had paid a far graver price for speaking the truth alongside me. I endured threats that permeated my every waking moment, echoing in the silence of the night as I lay in bed, unable to escape the shadow of fear that loomed over me like a dark cloud. In these unsettling moments, I bore witness to the moral decomposition of those around me, people I once admired who had traded their principles for power and greed, further deepening the chasm of betrayal in my heart. Yet despite the turmoil and pain, the conviction that I was making a difference, however small, sparked a flicker of hope within me. Every instance of resistance reminded me that what I was fighting for, that glimmering ideal of justice, was worth every sacrifice. It was not just about my own journey, but about giving a voice to the voiceless and standing up for those who had long been silenced. The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, yet I had embraced it fully, fueled by the knowledge that failure was not an option. Each step forward was a declaration that integrity and courage remained alive even in a world riddled with corruption. I clung to that thought as a lifeline, knowing that the fight for justice was not merely a personal quest, but a necessary struggle to restore faith in a system that had faltered so profoundly. In time, the internal review that had been set in motion uncovered a vast network of corruption that extended far beyond individual misdeeds. The process was slow and excruciating, as entrenched interests fought tooth and nail to protect themselves. I bore witness as some officers, unable to reconcile with the accumulation of their sins, chose to step down. Others, like Officer Jenkins, began to actively seek redemption by cooperating with the investigation and offering critical insights regarding the inner workings of the corrupt network. Jenkins' transformation was no less than miraculous. Once complicit in minor cover-ups, he had slowly evolved into a man haunted by remorse, yet determined to atone for his part in the shameful legacy of our department. During one clandestine meeting in an abandoned parking garage, he confided in me, "Marcus, every day I live with the knowledge of what I've done. But I hope that maybe, just maybe, my mistakes can somehow contribute to building a better force, a force that future generations can trust." His words underscored the heavy burden of culpability, yet also served as a clarion call to those who still believed in the possibility of change. Jenkins glanced around the dimly lit garage, ensuring no one was eavesdropping. The faint echoes of distant traffic filled the silence between us, giving our conversation an added layer of secrecy. "I've been working on something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A proposal for reform. We need to be proactive, not reactive. It's time we hold ourselves accountable and create a training program that emphasizes ethics and transparency." His eyes gleamed with a mix of hope and fear, the weight of his ambitions evident in his expression. As he spoke, I could feel the weight of his journey pressing against my chest. Jenkins wasn't just trying to expunge his guilt. He was striving to forge a path toward redemption for all of us. "But I need your help, Marcus," he continued, leaning closer. "I know you have connections. We could reach out to community leaders, activists, even some retired officers who want to see real change." The urgency in his tone was palpable. I hesitated, pondering the risks involved. Aligning myself with Jenkins could jeopardize my career, and yet the vision he painted was undeniably tempting. A department cleansed of its dishonesty, where officers upheld integrity rather than manipulate the system. A chance to rebuild trust with those we had wronged. "I'll think about it," I replied cautiously, feeling the stirrings of hope battling with my apprehension. The following weeks were filled with sleepless nights and internal conflict. I watched as Jenkins began to gather support, quietly speaking with colleagues who were as discontented as he was. Slowly, a coalition began to form. Officers willing to risk their careers for the promise of a more just and accountable force. Jenkins became the unassuming leader of a movement, rallying our fellow officers behind a shared vision, while I weighed each of my decisions as if they were a tightrope walk. Our clandestine meetings soon transitioned from the garage to the warmth of local coffee shops, where muffled conversations took place around the hum of espresso machines. The stakes escalated when we reached out to a local nonprofit that specialized in police community relations. They were excited by our proposal and agreed to host a public forum where we could present our ideas. This was it, the moment of truth. Would the department close ranks, or could this initiative spark a true shift in our culture? On the night of the forum, I felt a storm of emotions. The room was filled with a mix of concerned citizens, frustrated parents, and hopeful advocates. Jenkins presented our vision with passion, listing the necessary changes that could revitalize our department and restore faith in law enforcement. As he spoke, I was struck by the unity that began to form in the room. Men and women from different backgrounds, all yearning for the same outcome. The applause that followed was not just a sound, it was a promise, a commitment to move forward on something that mattered. But lurking beneath the surface, there were still those who opposed our vision. An anonymous letter arrived at my desk days later, filled with threats and warnings to cease my involvement with Jenkins. It felt like a shadow lurking, ready to pounce on our fragile gathering of hope. Yet as I read the words, I also felt ignited by a fierce determination. Fear was a powerful adversary, but the desire for change was stronger. In the weeks that followed, each of our allies faced their trial of faith. Moral dilemmas arose and old habits threatened to resurface. But the bond we were forming forged an unshakable foundation. The public outcry pushed the department to respond, and a new era of dialogue was slowly beginning, one where voices could no longer be stifled. Jenkins had transformed from a man burdened by the past to a leader who held the future in his hands, and so did I. The ensuing months were a blur of courtroom hearings, internal tribunals, and media frenzy. I found myself thrust into the epicenter of a reform movement that was both exhilarating and devastating. The once unified front of corruption had fractured into bitter factions, some holding on desperately to power, while others bowed under the weight of their conscience and chose to cooperate with the reform process. I saw men and women I had once admired sink into despair, only to later rise with a newfound humility born out of understanding the true cost of their actions. Throughout this period, I continued my work on the front lines, yet every case I handled now bore the heavy undertone of a system in crisis. The chill in the corridors of the station had not fully lifted, and I could still feel the stares of colleagues who had not yet found the courage to stand for what was right. Still, with every step forward, I felt the glimmer of hope that one day our police department might reclaim its honor and integrity. In the rare moments of quiet that punctuated the chaos, I found solace in introspection. I would often drive through the city after sunset, watching as the neon lights flickered against the dark silhouette of skyscrapers and sidewalks alive with the energy of a restless urban pulse. Those drives became meditative journeys where I processed the labyrinth of emotions, guilt for the system's failures, sorrow for lost comrades, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals of truth and justice. I kept a journal during these reflective periods, chronicling every setback and every small victory. There were days when the weight of my revelations nearly broke me, and I questioned whether a single man's resistance could ever alter the tide of widespread corruption. But then I would recall the faces of the victims, the needy communities looking up to the police as a shield against chaos, and the brave officers who risked everything to uphold justice. Their memory fueled my resolve. One chilly evening, as I sat in my dimly lit room surrounded by scattered papers and ink-stained pages, I felt an unshakable sense of duty settling into my bones. The clock ticked steadily, a constant reminder that time was slipping away while injustices remained unaddressed. Determined to transcend the confines of my thoughts, I decided that I had to take action beyond the ink of my pen. It was imperative to transform my journal entries into tangible change. I reached out to local activists, poets, and even artists who believed in the cause, gathering a coalition of passionate souls who shared my vision. We arranged community meetings where I spoke openly about the systemic flaws that perpetuated the cycle of violence and poverty. At first, I felt overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the task at hand. Thousands of voices clamored to be heard, and I knew that the challenge was far greater than my singular experience. Yet in every heartbeat of the crowd, I found strength. We decided to launch a grassroots campaign, aiming to shine light on the darkest corners of our city. Flyers, social media posts, and community events began to weave a narrative of hope and endurance. One day, as I handed out flyers at the local park, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She told me how my words had inspired her to stand up against her abuser, to reclaim the power that had been stolen from her. In that moment, I understood that my journaling was merely the beginning. As months passed, the ripple effect of our efforts became palpable. People began to unite, setting aside their fears and trusting in the strength of collective action. We organized peaceful protests demanding transparency and accountability in local law enforcement. Our movement began to gain traction, garnering attention from local media. With each passing day, I felt the weight of hopelessness lift, replaced by an invigorating wave of possibility. We formed alliances with watchdog organizations, advocating for policy reform that would hold corrupt officials accountable. Along the way, I continued to document our journey, blending my experiences of resistance with the voices of those around me. Each chapter I wrote revealed the intricate tapestry of human resilience. The victories, no matter how small, illuminated the path forward, revitalizing abandoned neighborhoods, reinstating essential services, and rekindling hope in the hearts of those who had long given up. As daylight broke over our city on a day we declared a day of action, I could see how far we had come from my solitary reflections. The collective spirit of our community was undeniable. Standing on the podium, addressing a sea of determined faces, I felt a surge of gratitude for each individual who had dared to dream of a better future. Together, we were not just writing the narrative, we were living it. And I knew that even in the darkest times, our collective light would guide us through. One entry in my journal stands out vividly. It read, "Today I face the stark reality that integrity is not an abstract concept, but a daily struggle. Every look in the mirror reminds me that I am not defined by the corrupt actions of others, but by my unwavering commitment to doing what is right, even when it blinds me to comfort or safety. I walk in the shadows so that others may find the light." Those words, written in a moment of vulnerability, came to embody the ethos of my journey in a place where darkness had long reigned. As the dust of the internal purges began to settle, the precinct was left scarred but slowly beginning to heal. Reforms were implemented, and new leadership emerged from the ashes of the old order. I found myself standing on a precipice, looking out over a department that was being remade almost as if in a cleansing fire. The path to redemption for so many of my colleagues was far from linear, but there was a sense that the future might one day be brighter. In the wake of the reform, numerous officers who had engaged in corrupt practices began to share their stories publicly. Some sought forgiveness by acknowledging their complicity, while others attempted to justify their actions as necessary evils in a broken system. One such officer was Detective Martin, a man with a rugged exterior and a troubled past who had once been one of the staunchest enablers of the corrupt system. His transformation was gradual but profound. In a candid press conference, he said, "I was once a cog in a machine that cared little for the truth. But now, having witnessed firsthand the devastations wrought by our misdeeds, I stand before you as a changed man, dedicated to mending the wounds I helped create." His words resonated with many and served as a reminder that even those who had strayed far from the principles of honesty could find a path back. As his new journey began, Detective Martin found himself bombarded with mixed reactions. Some embraced his newfound honesty, while others remained skeptical, viewing his transformation as nothing more than a strategic ploy to evade the consequences of his past. Nevertheless, Martin pressed on, determined to turn his guilt into action. He volunteered to speak at local schools and community centers, sharing his story not just as a confession, but as a cautionary tale aimed at the youth who still held aspirations of joining the force. "I want them to understand that integrity is not just a word, but a commitment," he would say, his voice tinged with both regret and resolve. "The badge should represent honor, not betrayal." As more officers followed suit, a movement began to take shape, called Project Redemption, aimed at providing mentorship for new recruits and fostering a culture of transparency within the police department. The ripple effects of Martin's transformation reached far beyond his initial press statement. His efforts inspired community forums where citizens could express their grievances and share their visions for a more just policing system. For the first time in years, residents felt their voices mattered, engaging in dialogues that shifted the narrative from confrontation to collaboration. Among those attending these forums was a young woman named Rosa, whose brother had fallen victim to the very injustices Martin once propagated. Initially reluctant to trust an officer, she found herself captivated by Martin's vulnerability. "It's easy to preach change," she told him during a particularly heated discussion. "But how do you plan to dismantle years of mistrust?" Her question weighed heavily on him, serving as a stark reminder that rebuilding a tarnished reputation would take more than just words. Motivated by the sincerity of voices like Rosa's, Martin, alongside a diverse team of community activists, established regular outreach programs where citizens could interact directly with the police. The goal was simple but ambitious: to bridge the gap that decades of corruption had widened. They organized community policing initiatives, designed patrols that included both officers and local residents, and created safe spaces for open dialogue. Slowly, faces began to change from frowns of distrust to tentative smiles of understanding. Meanwhile, the broader implications of the reform echoed throughout the city. The media, once fixated on the stories of corruption, began to highlight the positive changes taking root. Editorials praised the courageous officers like Martin, while investigative journalism undertook to scrutinize the evolving practices within the force, holding them accountable in their quest for redemption. At the heart of it all, Detective Martin remained steadfast in his mission. "Every day is a new opportunity to do better," he would remind his fellow officers during morning briefings. "Let's make sure we seize it." There were obstacles, to be sure. Not every officer was on board, and not every community member was ready to forgive. However, as stories of progress filled the airwaves, hope began to flourish. The journey toward genuine reform was long, but with each small victory, a foundation was being laid upon which a new legacy of policing could be built. One rooted in integrity, community, and above all, trust. For me, the aftermath of the upheaval was a mixed blessing. While I celebrated the successes of reform, I also mourned the loss of colleagues who had fallen by the wayside, victims of a system too corrupted to save them. Each day was a bittersweet reminder that the battle for justice was far from over. I continued to work on the front lines, supporting initiatives aimed at fostering transparency and accountability. I mentored younger officers, sharing with them the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds are stacked overwhelmingly against them. In the ensuing years following the sweeping reforms, the department began what could only be described as a long road to healing. Policies once buried under layers of deceit became open to public scrutiny. There were community outreach programs, internal audits, and even public forums where citizens could voice their concerns about the police. I was often called upon to speak at these forums, where I recounted my experiences and warned against the dangers of complacency. I stressed that while change was possible, it required constant vigilance from every officer and citizen alike. I formed a small support group with other reform-minded officers, a coalition that met regularly to share strategies, success stories, and even failures. These meetings, held in modest community centers and quiet spaces away from the corridors of power, became a sanctuary where hope was nurtured. We debated policy changes, ethical challenges, and the societal factors that had allowed corruption to seep into our ranks. In that collaborative spirit, I began to see that our struggle was not just a fight against individual wrongdoing, but a battle for the very soul of law enforcement. As the weeks turned into months, our coalition grew stronger, attracting the attention of allies from unexpected places. Community leaders who once viewed law enforcement with skepticism began to see us as partners in the fight for justice. They attended our meetings, sharing their perspectives on how our roles intertwined with the hopes and concerns of the neighborhoods we served. Together, we crafted outreach initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between officers and civilians, emphasizing transparency and accountability. One pivotal project we launched was a series of community forums designed to facilitate open dialogue. These forums allowed residents to voice their grievances directly to officers, fostering mutual understanding and trust. I remember one particularly impactful evening when a young man, distraught over the loss of a friend to police violence, took the microphone. His raw emotion cut through the air, reminding us that behind every statistic lay a life, a family, and a community yearning for justice. That night, we collectively vowed to ensure such tragedies were never repeated. Amidst the progress, however, challenges loomed large. Our dialogues drew the ire of entrenched interests within the department, who saw our efforts as a threat to the status quo. Rumors circulated and whispers of dissent grew louder. Yet our resolve did not waver. We knew the path ahead would be fraught with obstacles, but each small victory, be it a successful community outreach event or policy reform proposal, replenished our spirits and motivated us further. One day, our persistence paid off when we were invited to present our findings and proposals to the Chief of Police. It was an opportunity we had long envisioned, a chance to lay the groundwork for systemic change. Armed with data, testimonials from community members, and passionate anecdotes from our own experiences, we stepped into the boardroom with a blend of anxiety and determination. As we spoke, I could see the familiar reactions. Skepticism masked by feigned interest at first. But slowly, as we shared our vision of a new era of policing, they began to listen. There was a palpable shift as we illustrated how a reformed force could benefit not just the community, but officers themselves, creating a safer environment for everyone involved. The road ahead remained uncertain, but my commitment had transformed into an unwavering sense of purpose. We realized that our coalition was more than just a support group. It was a movement, gradually igniting a spark within the department and beyond. Each meeting fueled new ideas, expanding our outreach to include workshops for training officers on de-escalation techniques and bias awareness. We held coffee chats, inviting officers of all ranks to share experiences and insights, fostering a culture of respect and empathy. In time, the tides began to shift. The partnership with the community blossomed, attracting media attention and inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring precincts. As we grew bolder, our mission became clear. We were not merely changing policies, we were reshaping the narrative of law enforcement itself. With every step we took together, I felt the weight of the badge evolve from a symbol of authority to a beacon of hope. As new officers joined our ranks, eager to be part of the transformation, I realized that this was not merely a quest for reform. It was a legacy in the making, a blueprint for a future where justice was not just a word, but a lived reality for all. With every training session, every community event, and every conversation fostering trust, I saw that our mission was more vital than ever. And in that realization, I found the strength to carry on, fortified by the knowledge that we were not alone in this fight. Together, we would not only reclaim the soul of law enforcement, we would redefine it for generations to come, rooted in principles of fairness and accountability. Every story we shared was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. One officer, a veteran with decades of service, tearfully recounted how the constant exposure to corruption had almost broken him until he found solace and redemption through the collective strength of his peers. His journey, as painful as it was, provided a glimmer of hope to many who had lost faith. I took comfort in realizing that above all, our shared experiences were forging a community that valued truth over convenience. Looking back on my years in service now, I see a collage of moments, each one a thread in the elaborate tapestry of my life as an officer of the law. I realized that my journey was never solely about battling corruption in an institution rife with unethical practices. It was about laying the groundwork for a legacy of hope, accountability, and unwavering ethical commitment. I remember a particular day in the early spring when the city slowly emerged from the clutches of winter's bitter chill. I was called to a community center where residents gathered to thank the police for a recent initiative that had successfully curbed violent crime in their neighborhood. As I listened to their heartfelt gratitude and saw the renewed sense of trust in their eyes, I understood that every sacrifice, every harrowing encounter, and every sleepless night had been worth it. In that moment, I promised myself that I would continue to serve as an example of integrity for as long as I could. As the applause resonated through the hall, I took a moment to reflect on the journey that had led us here. Each step was paved with challenges, but it was also filled with moments of triumph and connection. Among the gathered crowd, I noticed a young girl, no older than 10, clutching a handmade card that simply read, "Thank you, officer." The innocence of her gesture struck a chord within me, reminding me that our efforts were not just about numbers or statistics. They were about real lives, dreams, and futures. After the event, I stepped outside into the crisp air, the scent of blooming flowers beginning to break through the lingering cold. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the vibrant colors of the world coming back to life. I made my way down the peaceful streets, the laughter of children playing nearby filling the atmosphere with warmth. It was in these simple moments that I found my resolve reinforced. Each smile I encountered was a reminder of why we fought to build safer communities. As I walked, I couldn't help but think about the next steps we needed to take. While crime statistics showed improvement, the underlying issues that bred distrust and division still loomed large. That evening, I sat down with my colleagues at the precinct, discussing strategies that would foster even deeper connections with the community. We brainstormed outreach programs, including youth engagement initiatives that would provide mentorship and support to the local children, instilling in them a sense of hope and purpose. Additionally, we talked about organizing town hall meetings, where residents could voice their concerns and play an active role in shaping their neighborhood's future. The significance of partnership was clear. It was no longer enough to simply patrol the streets. We had to embrace the community as allies in the fight against crime. Days turned into weeks as we implemented our plans, and gradually I began to witness the fruits of our labor. Families were participating in neighborhood watch programs, and local businesses were collaborating with us to create safe spaces for events and activities. The bond between the police force and the community grew stronger, blossoming into a mutual respect that was palpable in the interactions we shared. It wasn't always easy, and setbacks occurred, but with every piece of progress, my faith in our mission deepened. I realized that for every challenge we faced, there was an opportunity to build and grow together. Each person I met became a part of my story, and I a part of theirs. And in every smile, every shared moment of understanding, I found inspiration to continue this journey, one where integrity and service would always lead the way. The transformation was not complete. There remained wounds that would take time, perhaps even decades, to fully mend. But as I mentored younger officers and fostered community partnerships, I began to see that the very fabric of the police force was shifting. The corruption that had once festered unchecked was now being replaced with a commitment to transparency and mutual respect. I forged bonds with officers from former rival factions, and together we worked to rebuild trust, both within the department and among the citizens. Now, as I write these words, many years have passed since I first set foot in that ill-fated precinct. My body bears the marks of the countless struggles, and my mind is etched with memories both painful and uplifting. I have lost friends, witnessed the rise and fall of many, and endured solitude in the relentless pursuit of justice. Yet through it all, one truth remains unassailable. Integrity is not measured by the absence of conflict or moral peril, but by the courage to face them head-on. I still recall the cold, bitter night when I first promised to remain steadfast in my convictions. Despite the mounting pressures that sought to suffocate my resolve, and the horror of betrayal from those I once called colleagues, the air was thick with an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the distant echoes of laughter from those who had succumbed to the allure of power and profit, leaving honesty to wither in their wake. Each challenge I faced, whether it was the underhanded whispers behind closed doors or the veiled threats of those willing to silence dissent, only served to reaffirm my belief that even in a place riddled with corruption, one individual's unwavering commitment to truth could ignite a revolution, a change that would resonate through the hearts of the marginalized and forgotten. I carry a bittersweet pride for having been a beacon of hope in a dark corridor, even if the light was flickering and frail. My journey has taught me that every small act of integrity can accumulate, creating a luminous pathway for others to follow, reminding us all that resilience can flourish even in the most oppressive of environments. As I stood there shivering in the shadows, the world around me seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own, a heartbeat marked by the courage of those still fighting against the tide of deceit. I found solace in the knowledge that while I was but one voice, I was not alone. Slowly, like-minded souls began to gather, drawn to the flicker of passion that refused to be extinguished. Together we forged alliances, creating a tapestry of unity woven from the threads of our struggles and aspirations. With each meeting held in secret, we shared our stories, vulnerable yet unyielding. We spoke not just of the injustices we faced, but of the future we envisioned, one painted with strokes of accountability, transparency, and dignity. The more we connected, the more emboldened we became, igniting a collective fire that blazed brightly against the icy grip of despair. It was a fierce reminder that while shadows may loom large, they are never impenetrable. As our movement gained traction, we birthed initiatives rooted in advocacy, reaching out to those whose voices had been silenced for too long. We organized rallies, workshops, and awareness campaigns, each event a deliberate step toward dismantling the systemic barriers that kept us shackled. The laughter that once echoed from the hollow shells of corrupted halls transformed into chants of hope and defiance, reverberating through streets once dominated by fear. Yet with each small victory came the unmistakable sting of resistance. The forces of oppression did not remain idle. They responded with threats, intimidation, and sometimes violence. I quickly learned that courage is often paired with sacrifice, an enduring lesson that weighed heavily on my conscience. But it was in these moments of turmoil that I witnessed the true resilience of my comrades. They stood resolute, undeterred by the shadows looming over us. Each act of unity fortified my soul, reminding me that together we could weather any storm. And so, as the seasons changed, I found myself transformed. I had ventured into the depths of darkness, only to emerge with unshakable resolve. The commitment I had made on that bitter night grew beyond mere words. It became a living, breathing force that propelled not just me, but an entire movement forward. Our fight showcased the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to live in the shadows, allowing their voices to mix and mingle in a powerful symphony of resistance. As I stand at this precipice of change, I am filled with a profound sense of purpose and the belief that our collective struggle is not in vain. Each candle lit in remembrance of those we have lost, every hand held in solidarity, is a testament to the belief that we can reshape our reality, forging a path toward a brighter tomorrow. Indeed, from the ashes of betrayal, we rise, committed to nurturing the seeds of integrity in this garden of resilience. As I reflect on the past, I see not just the scars of a broken system, but the potential for renewal that lies in each of us willing to take a stand. I have learned that moral conflict is an inevitable part of serving in a system as complex and flawed as ours. Each ethical dilemma forced me to redefine my values and to sharpen my resolve to do no harm, even when harm seemed like the only currency in a corrupted world. Today I continue on the path I chose so long ago, not merely as a police officer, but as someone who dares to dream that even the deepest corruption can be cleansed by the relentless pursuit of justice. I stand as a reminder to the next generation of officers that integrity is a rarity worth fighting for, a treasure that must be guarded even when darkness presses in from all sides. I have come to understand that change is not merely a sudden shift. Rather, it unfolds slowly and demands unwavering perseverance, steady patience, and above all, an audacious willingness to stand alone when the tides of conformity seek to pull one under. In the labyrinthine struggles within the precinct, I see reflections of a more extensive societal issue, a resonant call for reform that reverberates through every institution where the lure of power threatens to root itself deep and where compromising one's principles can easily become the unquestioned norm. It is a stark reality that those who dare to challenge the status quo often find themselves isolated, yet it is in this solitude that I have discovered a profound truth. Hope is not an ephemeral fantasy, fleeting and intangible. Instead, it is a powerful battle cry, a resolute vow uttered defiantly in the face of relentless adversity. This hope fuels the fighters, igniting a spark in the hearts of many who have tasted despair, reminding us that even in the darkest corner, a flicker of courage can illuminate the path to a more just and equitable future. Many of my former colleagues, who once seemed irretrievably lost to the rot of their own ambitions, have now embraced the arduous path of redemption. Though some have been ostracized and others have quietly receded into the shadows, their stories remind me that the struggle for justice is always worth continuing. The department may never be perfect, but every small step forward is a testament to our unyielding desire for change. As I pen the final words of this account, I remain vigilant, aware that the fight for integrity is never truly over. I hope that future generations of officers, black, white, or of any race, will look upon my journey and be inspired to choose the narrow path of honesty over the wide, easy road of corruption. For it is only through such sacrifices that we can lay the foundations for a safer, fairer, and more just society. I am Marcus Johnson, a man defined not by the shadows that once threatened to engulf me, but by the enduring light of integrity that continues to guide my every step. And as long as I draw breath, I will remain a steadfast defender of truth in the face of every moral conflict and ethical dilemma that dares to challenge the ideals of justice. In recounting my journey, I do not claim to have conquered the pervasive darkness that once defined our precinct. Instead, I share my story as an invitation for others in similar positions to believe that change is possible. Despite the betrayals, the heartbreak, and the personal cost, I maintain that a single person's moral fortitude can resonate far beyond the confines of a corrupt institution. Today, as I stand on the outskirts of a new dawn, I am reminded of the resilience that lies in every heart, willing to stand for what is right. I have witnessed firsthand the transformation of a system built on deceit into one where truth is slowly being championed by men and women who refuse to surrender their integrity. The journey has been long and treacherous, yet the promise of a better tomorrow has always been enough to sustain me. I leave you with this final thought. In every shadow of corruption, there is a glimmer of hope waiting to be ignited. It is in our hands to nurture that hope, to stand firm against injustice, and to ensure that the legacy of our actions is defined not by the darkness we encountered, but by the light we brought forth. This is my legacy, a legacy that I hope will inspire future generations to continue the fight for a justice that is both fair and unwavering. As I close this chapter of my life, I remain committed to the promise that integrity, however challenged, will forever be my guiding star. The battle is far from over, and the path ahead may be fraught with danger and moral complexities. Yet, I am determined to keep walking that path, one step at a time, with my head held high and my heart steadfast in the belief that a force for good can emerge even from the darkest corners of our society. Let this story be a testament to every officer, every citizen, and every soul that dares to confront the pervasive influence of corruption. The struggle for justice is eternal, and it begins with a single honest decision. May we all strive to be beacons of light amid the shadows.